Hello to everybody. I'm Marco Beato, Associate Professor in Sport and Exercise Science at University of Suffolk. Today, we have the pleasure to have here Kevin De Keijzer that will talk about his experience as a strength condition coach at Ipswich Town Football Club. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Hi, Marco. Thanks for the introduction. So I've been working with the women's team now for 2 years, and it's been a really interesting experience. I am first and foremost an S&C coach, but I'm also doing my PhD at the moment at the University of Suffolk. I've also done my undergrad and my master's at the university, so I do feel like I'm a part of the furniture. I've been there for quite a while. I guess at this moment in time, I do feel like I'm quite passionate about educating and supporting athletes in their own journeys. And I've come to this conclusion thanks to the many opportunities. I've been very lucky to work in different environments in the US and here in the UK with different teams at university and sort of professional level, which has been really interesting. And one thing I do feel very strongly about is making sure that working with an athlete, working with a group of players, you get the most out of them by encouraging them and developing them as much as possible. And you learn a lot about yourself as an S&C coach. So that's why I guess I do what I do. But now going into a little bit of background about the team. The team at this moment in time from the women's perspective is composed of 2 teams. So we have a senior first team, which plays in tier 4 of the women's pyramid. And we have the youth or under 21s team, which is considered a tier 1 academy. And so they play against the likes of Liverpool, Chelsea, Man United, Man City. And so I guess this is an important differentiation, is because the younger players have certain ambitions and prospects because they're playing at a tier 1 level, whereas the senior players are and have been playing in tier 4 for quite a while. So there's a bit of a difference between ambition and prospects. And also another thing worth considering and mentioning is that the training experience and exposures that these 2 sets of players have is different and continues to be different, partially because the under 21s team has been training throughout the last lockdown and has been given more opportunities to train over the past couple of lockdowns. I guess another thing worth considering is that although as S&C coaches and maybe as football coaches, we view training this way, for athletes, it's the whole picture. And so it's important, in my opinion, to consider, do your athletes, are they involved with full-time work or part-time work? Are they full-time mothers? And how does that impact how they perceive training and how they perceive doing more or less away from training? So I guess one thing that we've tried to develop with our athletes is establish goals. And so working through goals and having this communication with them to create targets and then establish a peer group to maintain those targets together. So creating bubbles for players to then push themselves and make sure that they understand why they're doing this training. They're not just doing it just to do it. I guess one thing that's very tricky and probably will never be really relevant again was the lockdown training environment where players were stuck at home. One way that we tried to cope with this as an S&C team was to provide weekly or bi-weekly Zoom sessions. What was quite interesting was actually that players started to lead their own sort of S&C sessions, and they would break out into different bubbles and they would train in Zoom and they would lead these sessions, which was great from a social perspective. Ultimately, the sessions that I tried to lead, I always tried to have some elements of plyometrics, of balance work, and of single leg work to try and overload the muscles slightly differently. Obviously, this wasn't the whole training for the team that we provided throughout several months of lockdown, considering the fact that they had limited and varied equipment and confidence to use this equipment. We tried to cater to their needs and provide tailored programs accordingly. So initially what we would do is we would either prepare a weekly planner or go into prepare a monthly or a 2-weekly planner. This obviously depended on the player's capability to manage their time and organize themselves. Some players literally could not stick to I need to do a mobility session on Monday. Other players like to plan everything out and make sure that they had everything organized. Taking it to the next level, we had some players who would involve themselves with us as a staff to try and prepare training throughout the weeks. And so this was a really fun and interesting way to communicate with players, even if it was online, to report things like RPE, soreness, any particular issues or any sessions that they enjoyed. They could always leave notes, and this could obviously be useful as an S&C coach to prepare future sessions. The 3 main mottos that I've tried to keep in my head are to individualize sessions, to constantly adapt the sessions depending on how the athlete finds the workout or the training, and to obviously be patient, because as we mentioned earlier, although this is really important to me and this is everything, to them it's probably another piece in the big puzzle to consider. So now going into the bread and butter, the pre and in-season strength and power training obviously depends, once again, on the varied exposure and expectation of the players. Ultimately, I tried to break it down into the 3 different things that we've tried to do. I guess the main thing that we've seen most consistently is the in-session circuit type training, which I'll talk about in a second. We've also opted to perform or give players options to do 15 or 20-minute pre or post-training strength and conditioning sort of sessions. Traditionally, these slots would be for technical or tactical work, but because of the limited exposure to gyms, et cetera, we've tried to give the players opportunities to develop physical capacity during these times before or after training. Obviously, we have the traditional sense of dedicated sessions where the players would go to the gym or they would stay at home and train at home, separate to the current football session. So first of all, the first thing I'd like to talk about is circuit type training, which obviously we would propose to players before the session. We would tell them what we would need them to do, how long we would be doing it for. And the main concept behind this is just to get some form of training out. I think that the issue is that players can individualize their rest, because we would have 3 minutes per station. Players could do as little as even 1 set if they wanted to, as much as possibly around about 4 sets, depending on the exercise. This can be problematic, but with everything else considered, so with the limited equipment and the varied equipment as well, sometimes we might have access to dumbbells, other times we might not have access to anything. With a variation in time given from the coaches, obviously everything else included, we would have 10 to 30 minutes for strength or for power training. We would also be put in different places within the training ground, which also meant that we couldn't consistently say, let's meet here, we start off with this, and then we go on to the next thing. So it required a little bit of planning, a little bit of organization, and good communication and education of the athletes, which once again, I think is really important, because an athlete could very easily come in and say, oh, I don't want to do this because I don't care. Or another athlete could say, oh, I've done a strength session this morning, I don't need to do another session. But ultimately, it's about educating and communicating with them and saying, yes, if you have done some work, that's great, but can you make the most of these exercises? And instead of just maybe talking and distracting someone else, can you at least do 2 sets at a lower intensity, or can you do a little bit less volume if you need to? But that, in my opinion, generally comes down to just educating and communicating with the athletes well. So one thing that we've been really lucky to have recently, we've been provided with a flywheel, which is great in my opinion. And so one thing we tried to do is familiarize the athletes with the flywheel in a football-based way. So I've got here a picture of Alien versus Predator. And to me, honestly, this is how some of the athletes view the flywheel when they first see it. They're terrified of it. They don't want anything to do with it. They have no idea what it does. And so it requires a lot of time and attention. As you can see here in the video, you can see me in the background working with an athlete individually to try and get them to feel more confident and more competent, while other athletes are doing other things around the session. So ultimately, what we want to try and do is make sure that the athletes feel confident on the flywheel, all the while other people are getting other outcomes. So even if an athlete doesn't familiarize themselves in 1 or 2 sessions, they're still getting other good outcomes. They're still doing some form of plyometrics. They're still doing some form of squat, lunge, balance work. So I do believe that this is an interesting way to try and promote this type of training in a team-based environment if you are an individual coach or if you have limited equipment or staff. We all know, or it is quite evident now, that you need at least 2 sessions to familiarize yourself with session or with the flywheel, but maybe for some it's a little bit more. Some of the factors to obviously consider with the flywheel are the machines and attachments that you use. As you can see here in this video, we're using a vest, whereas earlier we were using a handle. The difference between the two is here that we have a little bit more time, so players can strap in and strap out, which can take about a minute or 30 seconds. But in the previous video, obviously you have players who can easily swap over with the handles. It doesn't take as much time. So more of a logistical thing. Another thing worth considering with familiarization is the familiarization from one movement, the lateral squat and squat, might be quite similar, whereas the familiarization between the squat and the RDL might be different, and that's something worth taking into account. When you're preparing and obviously telling athletes to do something, you need to take these things into consideration. Obviously, the neuromuscular demand of the flywheel is not to be underestimated, and it's very important to consider that athletes need to be familiarized with the intensity of the flywheel, especially at a maximal intensity, if it's in season and close to potentially a game or a training session, which the athlete or even the coach perceives to be very important. So if an athlete comes into the next session and they're very sore and they can't perform, or into the next game and they're very sore and they can't perform, the first thing that they will say is the S&C coach has done something wrong. So the planning and preparation that needs to go into making sure that any intense stimulus, like the flywheel, it needs to be of a good level, of a high level. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prepare the athletes to improve consistently. And so trying to implement some form of strength work within the warm-up could be an alternative way of adding additional work. What we've tried to explore is we've split with technical coaches where 10 athletes are with me and 10 athletes are with a technical coach. Or as you saw earlier in the previous video, there would be 20 athletes all doing the strength and football-based session together. This obviously depends on several factors like the experience of the athletes with the equipment and the movements, the experience of the coach. So if I'm very confident in the way that I've taught the athletes, then I'm happy to have 20 players. Whereas maybe if I need a little bit more time to teach them, I will split the group so I can dedicate more to the specific athlete. And also just it depends on facilities and staff, because if you're the only S&C coach and the football coach is busy doing something else, you can't split the group, but that's obviously goes without saying. Once again, just worth reiterating that recent and upcoming exposure is very important. So if you're going to introduce a very intense stimulus like a traditional flywheel squat, it can take some players a little bit of time to recover from that session. And so taking that into account when you're planning these sessions is very important. Ultimately, as you might have seen earlier, the inertial disc, the disc that we used was very small. And so the inertial load that we're using is not actually very high. And so you can actually question, are we doing strength work or are we doing power work? And how does that differ? So what is the real purpose of the movement that you're doing? What is the real purpose of the strength or power session that you're doing? And taking that into consideration. So here we have an example of a pre and post training session, flywheel squat. So as you can see, very similar to earlier. And we can see that the player needs a little bit of familiarization in the first 2 reps, a little bit of balance, but then they get a little bit better. Obviously, not every session has to do with the flywheel. We also have players doing other movements, which might be tailored to injury prevention, which might be tailored to plyometric training. It's important to consider all aspects of development, but I do believe that the flywheel can be an effective stimulus and an effective way to introduce some strength training to these athletes, especially over a period of lockdown where gyms have been closed. The other thing worth considering is the dedicated home training sessions. This obviously before lockdown would have probably been slightly different, but because of lockdown, the access that players have to equipment is going to be different. So what we tried to do was establish some key exercises that everyone understood, providing some videos and some context for the players to watch and understand, and also gave them a structured plan to return to training. So here we have a generic plan on the right side, coming out of the last lockdown and into a game, an FA Cup game, the week after 1 session or 2 sessions of training with the team. We knew that we had to do a lot of work at home to make sure that the athletes were not only physically capable, but also felt ready mentally to perform after only a week of team training. Obviously, we come here to the end, which is probably the most beneficial, the most effective way of training, to perform and prepare sort of dedicated gym programs where athletes spend time to train at home. We prepared with certain athletes prehab programs, uppers programs, and also lower body programs. These are probably the more comprehensive and consistent stimulus that is going to help athletes adapt and improve. But once again, this takes time and effort from my perspective as an S&C coach, but also from the athlete's perspective to learn and adapt and become more comfortable and competent in these movements, because they're not training with me, they're training on their own. And so I need to have the confidence that an athlete can do a barbell squat, an athlete can go on and do an RDL with a good technique. But it takes time, and hopefully we've gotten to that point now. I guess overall, in summary, it'd be interesting to consider that power and strength training within a part-time or an amateur or semi-professional environment with loads of different players who have different expectations and demands. It needs education, it needs familiarization, and it requires a lot of time and effort from a staff perspective, but also from a player's perspective. An analogy that I really like is a slice of the cake is better than nothing. And so, even if you want to have the whole cake, so even if you want to do, lots of strength training, or you understand, the athletes understand that there's a lot of purpose to strength and power training. Sometimes they might not have the time, they might not have the facilities, they might not have the confidence to perform it. And ultimately, it's important to consider how the strength and power training you are doing complements the football and the aerobic development of the athletes. So how can we make sure that the sessions that we're doing before and after the training session doesn't interfere with their football development, doesn't interfere with their aerobic development? So yeah, just having a holistic understanding of how to implement strength and power training, it's probably just as important as what you do. So the timing and the preparation, not just the exercises. I'm still very early on in my journey, but I'm really looking forward to developing this skill and understanding how to help athletes. Thank you for your time. If you want to contact me, you can contact me on Twitter or via email if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Kevin. It has been honestly a pleasure. So I like obviously your presentation, and we have now a lot of information about obviously female football. So I would like to ask you a couple of questions about your experience. So if you need, for example, to give some tips to practitioners that work in semi-professional or professional female football. So I would like to ask you the first point. It is, how many times a week do you have strength training, for example, obviously per week with your athletes? So if you take in consideration if one athlete, how many times a week can you have training, strength training with these athletes?
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider the context. So if some athletes are training twice a week from a footballing perspective, introducing some form of strength or power training once or twice a week for the lower body is probably going to be an effective stimulus. Some athletes actually really enjoy going to the gym, and they want to do more. And so sometimes you have to tell them to do a little bit less, or make sure that you give them enough rest. But once again, it just goes down to educating the athlete and understanding what some of their limitations might be from a time and from an access perspective. But I would recommend anywhere between 1 to 3 strength or power sessions throughout the week, taking into account possibly the previous game or the previous scenario. So if, for example, we're in an in-season and the athlete or the player hasn't taken part in the previous game, maybe doing an additional power or strength session during the week could be an effective way to add a little bit of stress to then make sure that they can keep up or improve in comparison to the rest of the players. But yeah, it's a tricky question, I would say. At least once a week from a strength perspective, potentially 2 times a week would be ideal.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And how can you differentiate between players that have obviously played the match and player that, for example, didn't play? So do you have a different training program for the two groups or not?
Yeah, so we try to cater to the aerobic needs or the anaerobic sort of needs that some athletes might have. What we typically find, at least within, obviously through COVID, we haven't been able to play, but in the previous season, what we found was that the manager would choose a very consistent amount of players. And these players would be playing both in the younger team and the older team. And so these players could be playing twice a week. And so realistically, they would play on a Wednesday and a Sunday, and a Wednesday and a Sunday. They would be training at school as well. And they would have to sometimes compete for school games, which obviously they would not really take part in. But ultimately, these are very capable athletes who are representing England, so playing at an under-19s level, who are dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of load, and maybe aren't very well educated on what they need specifically. And so if they see something like a heavy squat, they probably think to themselves, that's just going to make me tired, that's going to make me slow, that's going to make me big. But between players, there was a huge variation last year, and it was consistent, where we'd have starter, and non-starter, maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes. And so it was about obviously motivating those players, first of all, to say, come on, you can make it into the team. But trying to adapt their training. Maybe before sessions, we would do a little bit of strength training. We would do a little bit of power training with the flywheel. We would do some plyometrics. And then at the end of training, we would add some high-speed running and we would also add some change of direction drills, which was a part of the circuit that I showed earlier. So just with the ball and without the ball. But it also depends on the time that the players have. So it is very, very difficult, but trying to tackle that within the first session. So either on after the game on the Sunday or the first session back on the Tuesday would probably be the best way, or how we try to cope with those.
Perfect. Thank you very much. This is honestly a very, very good explanation. So I would like to ask you the last thing, and is about the training program that you planned to do at home. That is quite curious, because obviously maybe the player don't have so much time to on the pitch, or maybe they struggle sometimes obviously with travels and other commitments. And also there was the COVID period. We still have COVID period in reality, and we are back just now. So the question is, how can you monitor training load during the home training? What are your tools? How can you decide if someone have done the right amount of training, or someone have done maybe not enough or too much?
Yeah. So one thing that we've tried to introduce was the use of these RPE scales, and it's difficult because some players are really not against, but they don't enjoy the communication aspect of this is how the session went. So one thing that we've tried to develop is, that communication. So we've built group chats with us and the physiotherapist. We know when they're meant to do sessions. We message them every once in a while, but we also don't want them to become dependent on us to say, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done that? Because ultimately, we don't have the facilities or the time to do that as a staff. And so, especially if we're doing it for all the players. But what we try to do is empower them by giving them the tools to manage their time. And also, if we do it, for example, on Google Sheets or through Polar Flow, which is an app that's pretty cool that comes with a heart rate monitor, you can track the players' comments, and you can speak to them, and they can speak to the app, and then you can look at the comments and stuff retrospectively. So rather than it being, oh, how was your session today? Yeah, the session was good. It can be the player responds or reports their RPE, and then log some comments, and then we can view those after a week, after a month, after a year, and we can start to see chronically how they're adapting to the sessions. So it's important to take into account that, but we don't do it for all the players because some of them don't want to do it, and we can't force them. It's difficult. You try to educate them, but then if they don't understand why it's important, then to be honest, it's very, very difficult to monitor that.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. So I like that you share obviously the difficulties of the training load monitoring, because that is the truth. And sometimes we struggle. We have technological limitation, or sometimes it's more the interaction with the player, and each of them is different. So it's nice to see that also in a professional club, sometimes there are things that are a bit complicated, and this is not true only for amateurs. So Kevin, thank you very much for your presentation. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you, Marco.